Good afternoon, everybody. We'd like to begin before the weather catches us. My name is Karen Harris. I'm in the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies, and I'm also the Director of the University of Pretoria Archives. I want to thank you all for your attendance this afternoon, particularly given the current situation. We're going to have a very informal session this afternoon, and I'm very, very grateful that we have our Rector and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Taquani here. We also have a member, we were reminded this morning, of our faculty, but now an executive, Professor Norman Duncan. We have our own Dean, Professor Vasu Reddy, and the Dean of Theology, Professor Gerald Pillay. I want to thank everybody for being here, but particularly also those members from the Center and also from the archives. Very briefly, how did this converge? Well, it all begins with Mary. Mary is the center, was the center, and is at the center of the center. And when we heard about the documents in the center, we got our SWAT team and my colleagues in the archives descended upon 2 roomfuls of gold, the oldest AIDS center on the African continent. And I'm very glad to say we have all the documents and all the material in a temperature-controlled, password-protected environment on the Groenkloof campus in the Letlotlo building. So my colleague Ria, who unfortunately can't be here today, was packing and came across these beautiful paper prayers and said to Mary, wow, this would make an incredible exhibition. And I think the hearts of my colleagues in the archives sank as we then went about presenting and putting this together. I want to thank my archive colleagues, Daneline van den Berg in the department, my new colleague who's really been thrown in at the deep end, Dr. Abe Malombo, for putting this together and making it happen. Also with the assistance of Heather Tansman and our postdoc, Stephen Simons. But without further ado, I would like to introduce to you, who needs no introduction, Professor Taquani. Thank you, Professor.
A very good afternoon, everyone. Am I shouting? I thought you were so far, so I need to raise my voice, but sound like I'm shouting through the whole Gatfield campus. A very good afternoon to everyone, and of course I would like to recognize many people here, but to cut the protocol, given that this exhibition of an archive is related around Mary's tenure, allow me just to recognize Mary Crew and to say all protocol observed. World AIDS Day is celebrated around the world on the 1st of December, which is today. We are now 40 years into this pandemic, and each year we come together to reflect on a world with AIDS and how this pandemic is still having an impact on our societies. I must say also, if you are going to do a 40-year reflection, it must be a critical reflection, not just a narration of what has happened over the 40 years. So you will find in this speech I'm raising some critical questions without necessarily giving the answers. I think today, reflecting on 40 years should be a moment of also thinking critically about the future of how AIDS is managed in society. I would like to thank you all for joining us here today, in particular Professor Kim Berman from the University of Johannesburg Visual Arts Department. University of Johannesburg I can mention in full name because it's not the other place, the other place. December 1st is, in some ways, a northern date because it suits their work and academic calendars. Here, we are on the cusp of the holidays. We are very busy finishing off the year, collating marks, giving results, and managing the end of what has been another difficult year. It is a time when diaries are overfull and any time away from finishing off the many tasks seems like a luxury. Remembering World AIDS Day, however, gives us a bit of respite, a time out of our lives, and a moment to reflect on the lives of others. Many of you here today have never known a world without AIDS. In all too many ways, AIDS has been normalized and a part of our social fabric. For others, they can make a clear distinction of a world before HIV and AIDS and the world now. AIDS, it seems, has fallen from the public gaze. There are no more billboards on the freeways offering prevention advice or way to seek support. We no longer hear about AIDS orphans and other affected and suffering people. Do we any longer care, or are we so consumed with the latest pandemic, COVID, that we push the other pandemics further away and have a collective forgetting about their reality and their presence in our society? At UP, we are not part of that collective forgetting. This World's AIDS Day, we are talking about 40 years of memory. We are remembering all the people we know among our staff and students who are living with HIV and AIDS, accessing good treatments and medical care, getting support and counseling from their colleagues, and living with HIV in ways those of us who are not can never imagine. We are also remember staff and students who have died from AIDS-related complications, or our friends and other colleagues who have lost family members to AIDS. We have, we hope, created an institution where people feel safe to talk about HIV and AIDS, to talk about their fears of living with HIV, the concern for acceptance and an end of stigma, as well as living in a world that does not judge, does not comment on their lives, and at all times ensures the respect and dignity that we all expect. We may have managed this at UP. We have not managed this in the wider society, and I want to take a moment to reflect back on some of the previous World AIDS Days themes. How have we responded to these earlier calls for action? I've chosen just a few that concern some of the seemingly intractable social issues we face, and of course, the years that I have not included hold equally important messages. In 1990, the theme was Women and AIDS. 3 decades later, we could have the same message. Young women in South Africa remain disproportionately infected with HIV. In many cases, maternal transmission to their children still happens, or their babies are born drug-resistant. Women face immense barriers to accessing prevention. They still face shame and blame when they are in our clinics. In many cases, they are still blamed for bringing HIV into the home. All too often, HIV and AIDS is the cause of domestic abuse and violence. These conditions for women were exacerbated during COVID, and we need to reflect on how we allowed that to happen. In 1994, the theme was AIDS and the family. Here too, decades later, we still have families broken by migrant labor, families in which one or both biological parents are dead or absent, families where the young are looked after by the very old, where families torn apart by AIDS deaths, and the ongoing shame and stigma that communities place on families as they cope with the demands of care and support. We still have families where discussions about sexual behavior and sexualities are taboo, and where sexual abuse within families is locked in secrets. Families in whatever form, single parents, nuclear, or extended, are the bedrock of our society. And the fact that they are still so severely affected by AIDS is a shame we all share. In 1997, children living in a world of AIDS was the theme. Children still bear the brunt, very often the illness and death of their immediate and their extended families. Children experiencing grief and trauma need different ways of being taught, ways of being embraced by the wider society, and many expanded healthcare needs. Early in the epidemic, we were concerned about the very high numbers of HIV/AIDS orphans. We called them vulnerable rather than valuable. We were worried by child-headed households and the abuse of these young children. They have not gone away. We still have many young people orphaned by HIV/AIDS, young people trying to hold their households together, and young people trying to get the best access to education and health care they can. We abandoned them even before COVID, but they are now discarded. 2000 saw the theme of men make a difference. We all now talk about the need to include men in our programs and to engage with men and young boys. Nevertheless, we continue to stigmatize men, call them toxic, and talk about toxic masculinities as if they were a homogeneous term that embraces all men. Men are discussed in negative terms of patriarchy and power, of violence and control. I'm not saying here that these are not contextual and specific and group realities, but the stereotyping might actually hinder the solutions that we need. We also know that many men inhabit quite different masculinities, are excellent fathers and partners, do take care about HIV/AIDS transmission, but we talk about them in cliches, stereotypes, and platitudes. And to men, AIDS has allowed stigma, blame, and shame to stalk their identities. The issues of stigma were addressed in 2002 and 2003. It has been recognized since the start of the pandemic that stigma is a very powerful weapon, and we all use it with ease. All the people now identified as Q populations are identified in that way precisely because of how much society created, fed, and often encouraged stigma to thrive. Stigma attached itself very easily to gay men, to sex workers and women with AIDS, to young people who seem to be sexually active, to truck drivers, and to migrants. Instead of regarding such designated categories as active citizens, we added another label to them, that of key populations for prevention and care, singling them out as in some ways deviant, as needing special interventions because of particular behaviors they displaced, and even today, there remains an element of blame and deep stigma around those who inhabit different worlds from the mainstream. We are nowhere close to overcoming stigma, and we need to reflect on this that is being used in COVID. The same notions of blame and shame for those in one way or another don't conform. By 2007, it was recognized that a key element to addressing HIV/AIDS was leadership. Leadership that operated at many levels. Where is the leadership from the national, provincial, and local governments? From the captains of industry and the medical profession, what does leadership mean in a world of AIDS? All too often, it is reflected in the wearing of small metal red ribbon. Perhaps I don't have mine today because there was this line in my speech, of strips of plastic with World AIDS draped around the perimeter of buildings, of World AIDS Day functions, awards, and prizes. All of this is important, but it is too leggy. The problem with international days such as the one as we are recognizing today is that the social issues they raise are tucked away for a year. When last did we hear our government, political parties, captains of industry, academics talking in visionary and inspirational ways about HIV and AIDS? When last did we hear them acknowledge that the figures for HIV infections and AIDS deaths remain disturbingly high? When last did they offer us a vision for women and AIDS, the family and AIDS, children living in a world of AIDS, men making a difference, or finding ways to tackle and challenge stigma? Perhaps, like the rest of us, leaders have become tired of what was called in the early days of the epidemic, the long haul. Tired of the fact that HIV and AIDS is now deeply embedded in our society, and we have not managed it. The tired old messages no longer work. Treatments have been created the belief that AIDS is over. We talk eagerly about the effects of long COVID and dedicate many columns to the discussion. Where are the discussions about long AIDS? The understanding of the long wave of effects of HIV, the lifetimes of treatments, and possible illness for so many people? Where do we talk about AIDS and the society rather than signaling categories of difference? Where is the leadership that unites us, that inspires, that will challenge us in the next 4 decades? With the advent of treatments, the themes changed slightly. From 2011 to 2015, under various guises, the themes were about getting to zero. A public health ground zero, no new infections. While a worthy ideal, the reality of both the nature of viruses and society is that it is unlikely to happen. What such themes do, in unintended ways, is to deepen the notions of failure and stigma. For countries that show no significant progress to zero, intervention plans are suggested. Fact sheets and check sheets are developed. Action and 5-year plans are rolled out. Because in the end, if we don't get to zero, someone has failed. What HIV and AIDS have taught us is that we should be more reflective about how and why people behave. We need a far more nuanced understanding of risk and social identities. How are our various sexual identities constructed, understood, managed, and lived? What other forces are at play when we hear the messages around getting to zero or being safe? What does safely mean in a world of AIDS? The idea of getting to zero assumes that we are dealing with a homogeneous population who will, in this slippery notion of the public good, manage the complexity of their lives in a uniform way. Getting to zero developed into Know Your Status for World AIDS Day 2018. No one would dispute that knowing whether or not you have HIV is a good thing. What it allowed for, though, was deepening of cohesion and control. People talked about mandatory testing. HIV and AIDS workers talked on the one hand about human rights and social justice, and on the other, that everyone should get a test. As a society, have we interrogated why you need to know your status? And we all know that one can be negative one week and positive the next. How often do we test? Testing and the knowledge of one's status alone do not lead to a sustained behaviors that keep one safe. We allow the notions that if you did not know your status, you were a bad citizen, that you were irresponsible. The precondition for knowing your status is a society in which people with HIV are not treated as contagious, are not treated as deviants, are not treated as having done something against the common good. It is a serious simplification of the impact of HIV in people's lives. And finally, after all this attention on groups and individuals, the World AIDS Day theme from 2021 is about ending the HIV epidemic, of ending pandemics, and of eradicating poverty. UNAIDS sets ambitious targets for the 90, 90, 90, and these have been upscaled to 95, 95, 95, reducing the complexity of AIDS, of our AIDS world to numbers. So as we reflect on World AIDS Day themes over the past 3 decades or so, where does that leave us at UP? We know that we can prevent the transmission of HIV. We know that there are very distinct ways in which HIV is transmitted, and we know that certain behaviors place people at greater or lesser risk. But we also know that we are not living in a world that can be managed by themes and slogans, that we are living in a world that is a default setting, punishment, blame, and punitive actions. We know that we are living in a world where it is often easier to judge than to understand, easier to blame than to support, easier to shame than to act. We also know that we are living in a society deeply scarred by poverty, structural violence, inequality, and multiple forms of discrimination. We know that we are a deeply divided society in terms of class and access to education and healthcare. We know that pandemics are with us to stay, and that we have to learn to live with viruses and pandemics. Pandemics have been part of our human existence for thousands of years. And despite all the advances we believe that we have made, we will not prevent them or necessarily end them. We can, however, be honest about them. We can be honest about the fact that while great strides have been made in HIV prevention and treatments, there are many reports that we are sliding back, in part because we've been unifocused on this new pandemic. We can be honest about whether we are doing enough to recognize and celebrate sexual diversity, to understand that people are complex, and to celebrate sexual diversity, fascinating, and that they inhabit complex and fascinating worlds that they create or that are a reaction to the way society has treated them. We know that there are simple and basic things that we can do, such as the open provision of condoms and through counseling and support and testing when one asks for it. We need to be honest about how we address our own prejudices and stigma, and about how we judge people and how we collude with discrimination and oppression. Dealing with HIV/AIDS calls for an open and an honest society. It calls for a society that questions perceived wisdoms, that holds a deep skepticism about solutions and interventions. It calls for a society in which difference is celebrated as enriching us all rather than something that threatens us. We need to recognize that people will get infected with HIV, and that will have people living with AIDS, with all the issues around treatments that follow. And we need to recognize that we will continue to have many deaths from AIDS. The important thing is how we as a society and as a university create this world of honesty and acceptance. All of the themes I've highlighted speak to fundamental fault lines in our society and highlight them. It is up to us to act on them. The University of Pretoria has been addressing these multiple and complex issues of HIV/AIDS for over 2 decades. We can celebrate our success in consistently low HIV infection rate among our students. We can be proud of our student health services. We are proud of the work for the study of AIDS, now the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender. We have strong student activism and strong community outreach into schools and the communities around the campus. We can be proud of our HIV and AIDS work so far. We can also be proud of the excellence of the HIV/AIDS research in all of the faculties. We can be proud of the ways in which some courses have critically and intellectually engaged with HIV and AIDS, and know that all of these create students whose role and value as citizens is greatly enhanced. We also know that we need to remain the benchmark for other universities, that we need our HIV/AIDS programs and research to be critical, questioning, and innovative. We need to ensure that as UP deals with HIV/AIDS, we lead rather than follow society, which is actually the ordinary expectation, no longer so ordinary about what a university ought to do in a society. We need to set the standards for how we deal with AIDS, for how stigma is challenged, for leadership shared at all levels, and for thinking critically about how we transform the ways of our families and the men, women, and children who create them. We know that this work can be done across all faculties and campuses, and that the response should be wide and varied, contradictory at times, and often confrontational. We must make sure that we are not seduced by the silence that has enveloped AIDS to believe that we are through this epidemic. The evidence is to the contrary. We need to reignite intellectual debates, question, publish, and challenge, so that when the 2022 theme is announced, we can believe that we are leading and not following. I thank all the UP researchers for their excellent work, for the critical thinking and debate, and the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender for their ongoing work, and the students for their activism, and for always asking us to do more. Today, we are launching the HIV/AIDS and Gender Archive. This is, we believe, one of the most comprehensive collections of materials and documents gathered over 2 decades of collaboration, conferences, partnerships, local, regional, and international. This collection is currently being catalogued and curated and will be an invaluable base for a great deal of future research work. I'd like to thank and acknowledge UP Archives for their work in ensuring that these documents are stored and made accessible to the university community and the wider community it serves. These paper prayers, so beautifully displayed, are the vibrant memory of so many lives, so many people, and are now an expression of UP/AIDS work and the power of memory. I thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Coupe for opening this event and for being with us and for having so enthusiastically embraced the idea of the exhibition of the paper prayers. As we've talked, today we are thinking about memory. One of the most compelling books on AIDS and memory is Tangled Memories, written by Marita Sturken. Our memories are tangled, she says. They change over time, they become clearer and hazy as various things come into focus and other things blur. Memory is a narrative rather than a replica of experience that can be retrieved and relived. We need to ask how our memories are constructed, how they are recalled, and how they are interpreted. Of course, what we remember is highly selective, and as we retrieve it, it says as much about desire and denial as it does about remembrance. All memories are, of course, created in tandem with forgetting. Indeed, forgetting is often an important component of the construction of memory. And I believe that we, at our convenience, have forgotten an enormous amount about the early epidemic. And as we've lived through COVID, for people who lived through the early days of AIDS, there's a real sense that much of what we learned during AIDS has been forgotten. For me, one of the most powerful images for HIV and AIDS memory is the AIDS Memorial Quilt. The quilt was started to remember those who had died from AIDS, crafted by their partners and families to remember them. AIDS was, of course, a complete rupture in the fabric and threads of society, and the quilt offers a means of interweaving the political and the therapeutic. By combining a process of mourning with activist interventions, by naming individuals on the panels and incorporating them into a much larger fabric, the quilt integrates the personal into the public memory. Not only this, the quilt, dealing as it did initially with the excluded, the marginalized, and the vilified, brought those so easily discarded by society, gay people, drug users, sex workers, black people, immigrants, and the homeless, back into the mainstream. As we remembered them, surely we were acknowledging how easily we had discarded them, judged them, and excluded them. While the quilt is breathtaking in its beauty and its craft, what you tend to see is the veneer of people's lives. For me, when it's hung, it's the back of the quilt that, unlined, is the most moving. Here you see the social fabric, the tears, the ruptures, the anger, the patching, and the attempts to make things whole. This is meaning of the person, the tangled threads behind the perfection of the quilt, the expression of their lives. So how do we as a society embrace mourning? How do we negotiate the boundaries between private memory and the historical record? It is through theoring memory that individuals participate in giving meaning to the past. In South Africa, under the guidance of Kim Berman, who is with us today, we have a unique and beautiful collection of paper prayers. I remember very well the original World AIDS Day paper prayers in the Johannesburg Art Gallery, where many, many people came together to offer a visual representation of their grief, of the stigma they were facing, of their loss and their despair and their desperation. These prayers were crafted from the very depth of an epidemic that was bewildering in its ferocity, both the physical and the social toll, and these prayers offered a solace. What they also became was an expression of hope, of solidarity and comfort, an AIDS activism that could challenge the social tearing and with a new expression of belonging. Kim has graciously added to the UP collection, hanging behind you over there, and has shared with us today this cloth in front of her. And I would like her now to speak to us, to her vision of the prayers and her years of memory.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Coupe. Thank you, Mary. I'm absolutely delighted to be here at this fantastic occasion. I didn't expect to present anything formal, but maybe also recollect how and why paper prayers started. And Mary spoke about the quilt. And in the mid-80s, I left South Africa and was living in Boston and joined the ANC and various activist organizations. And AIDS was affected the gay population in Boston, and we went to Washington for the first unveiling of the quilt. And I remember on Washington Square, this quilt being unraveled, and recognized at that time the power of the image of memory, as Mary said. And I think that influenced me in how I wanted to come back to South Africa with something equivalent. And the first exhibition that Mary spoke about was in 1997 at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. Stephen Sack invited me to participate in a Paper Prayers exhibition. And in Boston, Paper Prayers was a campaign that was run by artists, for artists. And the idea was, came from a Japanese custom of taking an artwork as a memory and a gift of healing and well-being. And in Boston, there were a number of exhibitions on World AIDS Day, showed artwork that could commemorate and raise funds for hospices and various organizations of people living with AIDS. So the exhibition at Johannesburg Art Gallery was a catalyst. We then went to the Department of, it was then the Department of Arts, Science and Technology, Arts, Culture, Science and Technology, and suggested that this become a national campaign. And I think I first heard about Mary Crew around that time, who was a real legend in the HIV/AIDS movement. Part of Estlin Street, we were partnering as a small NGO called Artist Proof Studio, where we wanted to part with NAPWA, Estlin Street, the National, the Treatment Action Campaign that came later, and then offer this opportunity for people to engage with the stigma through art making. And how does it work? I think when you look at these paper prayers around you, and I like that we could hang one up on a washing line, because when you look at the work, the way we conducted the workshops is that our partner would introduce a workshop on HIV/AIDS, and people would respond with an artwork, thinking about a metaphor. For instance, and there are a couple of examples with the text where they would pick up a fence or a leaf, roll it up with ink, do a rubbing, transfer it onto paper, and then speak about the meaning. And the meaning was what they learned about prevention, stigma, self-care, hope. And for instance, there are a number of stories, and I'm offering these books as resources to the archive, and I'd just like to share one of them, where a woman in a small community in outside Free State, outside Welkom in the Free State, said, "I use the fence wire as a symbol of protection, especially at home, and also as a symbol of dignity. I have learned about protection for my family. This talks about the strong unity, working together and learning from each other." So this idea of a metaphor, taking a fence wire, printing it, and understanding the notion of unity, working together, solidarity, came through in these expressions of hope. And the idea that people could use these to share with members of their family the lessons they had learned, could break the silence, and at that time encourage people testing. And I think the power of paper prayers, and seeing it here and recognized as part of the archive, is a way of holding activism and hope and memory, and reusing it in different campaigns on gender-based violence, on various teen pregnancy, various things that we've used it in the past. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very grateful to be here and to congratulate the University of Pretoria in the archive, and to have this resource as an example for other institutions in the country. So I'm delighted to be able to share these informations and find a home for them. So thank you so much for the invitation and for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can now appreciate what Professor Coupe meant when he said there are people whose memories of AIDS go way beyond the immediate. But it was always a pleasure the work we did in Johannesburg together, and thank you. In his recent book called The Promise, Damon Galgut said, "Time passes differently for those who are shut out of the world. It travels like traffic at certain points of the day, inching across the ground. It seems to slide slowly by, but the days flicker fast, and so your face is different and not yours anymore." This could be a reflection of what it's like to live with HIV and manage AIDS in one's life. An HIV diagnosis and the impact of AIDS as a lifelong disease makes time pass differently for those with HIV and AIDS. People living with HIV or AIDS, still in 2021, are shut out of the world. They inhabit a world that is different from ours, and time and reality take on different meanings. Thoughts about the future are changed in complex ways, and managing both the treatments and the perception of one's lovers, family, colleagues, and children have to be found. This is particularly the case with HIV and AIDS. While a disease, like all other diseases, it particularly affects young people. People who are euphemistically called sexually active, i.e. the young, which seems to exclude anybody over 40. Disease attaches it to now stigma, shame, blame, and denial. It is all the more powerful when it's young people, and in particular young women. Our blame leads to endless speculation about sexuality, about gender, about various acts and positions, and in the end to judgment and a bewildering lack of acceptance of sexual and personal diversity, of difference and changing identity. One person who was deeply and profoundly involved in the work in HIV and AIDS in young people is our next speaker, Charmaine Taquani. She became in HIV and AIDS work in her early years as an undergraduate, developed and created a unique understanding of HIV and AIDS, of belonging and inclusion, and of exclusion, and the ways people were to be and are shut out. During AIDS, we had a different kind of lockdown. People were locked out. She developed an understanding of what it was like to be young in an epidemic, how the very fabric of youth was being rewoven, and how life needed to change and be different. How young people were facing very different responsibilities and decisions and choices. She changed the lives of many young people on UP and continues to do so in powerful ways in education. And we welcome her sharing her experiences of being in a university that was confronting HIV and AIDS.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Coupe, distinguished faculty members of the university. I would like to start off by just thanking Mary Crew for inviting me to this momentous occasion and for asking me to share briefly some of my memories of working in HIV and AIDS at the university. I started working firmly in HIV at the University of Pretoria in 2008. Prior to this, I was volunteering as a student at the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender, which was the Center for the Study of AIDS at the time. One of my earliest memories was walking into the training center and not knowing what lies ahead of me. I was literally a deer in headlights. What I knew about HIV was very minimal. I have very fond memories of my time working in HIV because I was quite young, in my early 20s, naive to some of the nuances in the field, such as prevention is not as simple as ABC. It's complex, fascinating, and contextual because people are complex, evolving, and fascinating. One of my biggest learning curves was working on the sexual network study we had done with UP students. The aim of the study was for us to understand the subtle sexual cultures that existed at a time in order to update our training resources so that the education and awareness information we put out there was relevant and spoke to the needs of UP students. The shift came for me during that study, and it shifted my focus from looking at HIV work as HIV work, but rather looking at it as people work. Not to say that other work on stigma, human rights, HIV counseling didn't contribute towards that shift, because it definitely did. It laid the groundwork and foundation for the shift to happen. However, the sexual network study had such a profound impact on me because I finally internalized the people work of HIV. Maybe it was because I was a UP student myself, working with the students to improve education and awareness among students. Another major memory for me was working in the Befriender program, doing pre- and post-test counseling at the Center Students' Health Services. The biggest lesson there for me was how people's stories matter and how to provide a safe space for people's vulnerability. It is an honor for someone to share and trust you with their story. That is something I never take for granted, and I carry with me today in my interactions with people. Working in the Future Leaders at Work taught me to be a lifelong learner, an active citizen, to meet people where they're at, and to understand the value of feedback. There is a laundry list of memories that I hold dear, from awareness campaigns, conferences, partnering with other universities, working with the Department of Health and Research Studies. The list really does go on. All of these memories and learnings wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the support and encouragement from Mary Crew, Pierre Brouard, Johan Maritz, and all the people and students I worked with at UP. Today, I work full-time in teaching, and I know for sure that doing the people work in HIV helped me be a better educator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like at this point to acknowledge all the volunteers who have worked in HIV and AIDS at UP over the past 20 years, and particularly those who are with us here today. Thank you. If you could indulge me for just a little moment, there are two people I need to thank. Both were hoping to be here, but both came into contact with people with COVID in the last couple of days. The first is, actually it also turns out they are both men. The first is Gustav Walford. He was the first person who had identified that an epidemic the size and magnitude of the AIDS one would have a deep impact on a university the size and magnitude of UP. Gustav and I have worked together in AIDS for many years, and we often disagree. He is a medic, and I'm a social scientist, absolutely incompatible. I value his work and his friendship enormously, and I've learned a great deal from him. He has always been unfailingly supportive of social science, and it drives him nuts at times, but he values the insights that without a profound understanding of the social, it is impossible to deal with HIV and AIDS. This is an insight that many donors and UN agents simply fail to recognize and understand. The second person who would also have been here today is Johan van Zyl. This is the first occasion I've had to publicly thank him for his vision and insight in starting and sustaining HIV and AIDS work at UP. The HIV and AIDS path that he set me on professionally and personally has been extraordinary. We have Johan to recognize that UP has such a sustained low HIV infection rate. Thanks to his insistence on testing and counseling, the recognition that we needed both a moral and an economic imperative to develop an AIDS response, and in the end, to see that at least this needed to be initially a standalone response, not located within the genders and ideologies of different faculties and personalities. He set the university on the path to 20 years of an AIDS response that he believes has become the benchmark against other which universities are measured. He resisted the need to have a conventional status quo response, and he understood that to challenge AIDS at a tertiary institution, you need skepticism, you need intellectual curiosity, you need to challenge all the taken for granted assumptions, you need to always challenge dogma, orthodoxy, and the established wisdoms, and to address this epidemic as the most fascinating social rupture of our time, and through using new and critical lenses to find new ways of thinking, new ways of understanding, and new ways of seeing. I believe that the UP AIDS response has lived up to that vision, and it is with enormous respect that I acknowledge our debt to him. Our last speaker is Vasu Reddy. Professor Reddy has long been committed to understanding the complex ways in which sexuality, desire, and social conformity has shaped the way our politicians, religious leaders, and citizens have responded to HIV and AIDS. His research has driven much of our understanding about diversity and the compelling need for wide debate and discussion across many sites.
Thank you, Mary. I must start out with a confession. I imposed myself on the program, and that the apology. But the main reason for doing so, you will see. If the theme for today was about memory, and certainly memory it is, memory is not only about the past, it's also about the present, and it's also about presence and indeed recognition. Colleagues, each year since 2016, and I have to pause because one hears the echo of your voice as you speak. When I arrived as dean, a year later, we instituted a faculty awards focused or called the Dean's Awards. Beyond teaching and learning and research, the Dean's Award recognizes and acknowledges colleagues in our faculty who are not otherwise recognized by established categories. These are people who make a real difference. These are people who are results-driven, who persevere in spite of the challenges, and who are inspirational. In 2019, we made 4 awards. The 3 were awarded, but 1 was not. Perhaps I could blame it on COVID 2020, but in 2021, we couldn't let it go. The missing person on that occasion was Mary Crew, who needs very little introduction to all of us. Mary Crew paid tribute to many who had contributed to the development of the center. Kim Berman described her as legendary, but perhaps I should say the following as my citation. Mary Crew is an iconic figure in the South African HIV, AIDS, gender, and sexualities context. She has been a notable, critical, and ethical voice in this landscape for over 4 decades. Her work displays intellectual clear-sightedness, a visionary force with humanistic integrity. Mary, UP, is so proud to have had you in our midst. Those of us who know her know her razor-sharp wit and mind. She suffers no fools. Mary invites all of us and provokes us to scrutinize our own ideas, compelling us to see the presence of new and innovative ways of engaging social problems. She seeks no attention, and she has demonstrated through action an immense contribution to UP as the founding director of the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender. And her repertoire of experience is rich. She was born in Johannesburg into a lower middle class family. She studied at the University of Natal in the late 70s. She worked as a teacher at Athlone Girls High School in Johannesburg, as a lecturer in the Faculty of Education at Wits University from 77 to 89, as well as a deputy director in the South African National Department of Health. And of course, since 1999, as the founding director of the Center for the Study of AIDS, which, as we know, was renamed to the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender. In that capacity, Mary has raised over 124 million rand for AIDS work at the university. In an interview I conducted with Mary about 2 years ago, she said the following about the conceptualization of the center. And she says, these are her words, "The ideas would be that this would be a center that would offer academic, intellectual perspective on HIV/AIDS through research and through questioning dominant narratives. And we would develop testing and counseling. And the center had 2 driving imperatives, moral and economic." And she said the following, "We had to create a campus environment which would be stigma-free around people living with HIV for different sexual orientations and for women." Also important, she was the founding editor of this formidable series called the AIDS Review, which addressed annually since 2000 pertinent questions of HIV/AIDS in the country. The text, incidentally, is also prescribed reading for many universities across the world. In 2017, she oversaw a new series of monographs on gender and social justice. And when there was deep social silence about HIV and AIDS at the turn of the 90s, it was Mary who wrote one of the first books on AIDS in South Africa, titled AIDS in South Africa, The Myth and the Reality. It's a title that still has resonance in the current context. Mary, in recognition of your pioneering and groundbreaking contribution to the faculty, indeed by extension, the university, thank you. This small token is our recognition and appreciation of your significant contributions, for which we are extremely grateful. Could I request Vice Chancellor to please present that to Mary Crew?
Thank you very much. I suppose I should have been innately suspicious when Vasu insisted that he wanted to be part of the program. I'm truly appreciative, Vasu, and thank you very much indeed. I certainly didn't expect it, and I hope that the work that we did at the center will be a lasting legacy at UP. And what we have managed to do, I think, is to have an enormous amount of fun. And I think in the AIDS world, that's essential. One has to have fun. Well, I now have to say that this brings us to the formal end of the program. We were going to have a talk by Ria van der Merwe about her work and the archives, but she is unable to be here today. And it's an honor to have this 40-year memory of UP. You will see in these bags, which have paper prayers printed on them, that there are the complete collection of the AIDS reviews and other materials which you are welcome to take with you if you'd like to and read within the next few months. In the envelopes, which are under that table there, are individual memories written by a number of my colleagues about their 40 years of memories of working at UP, and they make inspiring and moving reading. We have copied them, and they are in the envelopes, and if you would like to take one, please do and read them. It merely remains me to thank so many people, too many to name, who I've worked with over the past 20 years. To thank colleagues and students for all faculties and services. And in closing, I would like to thank you very much for during this extraordinary time of COVID, which, as Pierre and I were discussing, if you've lived through HIV and AIDS, at times seems entirely bewildering and chaotic in our response. But that in this bewildering time of COVID, with all its hysteria, its overreaction, its turning people into the enemies, its judging, its stigmatizing, the way we've been asked to report on our neighbors' behavior, the way we've been asked to put people under surveillance, in ways which were just astounding. I would like to thank you very much for braving all of that, adhering to the rules that we have to live by, and for joining us. We have plenty of wine and we have plenty of food. Thank you very much.